very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
I mean, your client went through an ICC process. I guess a broad, perhaps, question, but which I'm going to ask you to answer, but very briefly, is what were your experiences with the ICC machinery?
Well, let's just get one thing straight. There are a number of tribunals which have been established over the last few decades dealing with war crimes and crimes against humanity. My particular client, Charles Taylor, was tried in the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Yes. Although he was tried in the ICC premises in The Hague because it was decided to switch his trial from Freetown to The Hague. My experience of the process is that the methods of investigation and presentation of evidence in these international tribunals leaves a lot to be desired. For example, in the Taylor case, there was widespread payment of witnesses to give evidence. Likewise, there was the widespread use of hearsay, untested evidence in the Charles Taylor case, a lot of it. And I think that is totally unacceptable because judicial principles which we have come to accept in places like the United Kingdom and indeed South Africa, those checks and balances to ensure a fair trial are oftentimes absent in these proceedings. And one gets the impression, and it's an abiding impression that I have, that in those courts, the old principle of innocent until proven guilty has been thrown out the window. And basically, you are guilty until you can prove you're innocent. And that's not the way in which any system of criminal justice should operate.
And this is not a case of sour grapes simply because your client lost?
Not at all. Not at all. And I'll be quite frank, do not believe Charles Taylor should have been convicted on the evidence placed before that court. I don't think he was. And not merely because in terms of equality of treatment, others around the world who have behaved in the same way, that is, aiding and abetting rebel groups in other countries, as is currently occurring in Syria, have never been even considered for investigation for war crime. It's not even to do with that. It's the fact that in the Taylor case, to my mind, as someone who has practiced criminal law for over 30 years, the evidence was insufficient to justify his conviction. That's my firm view.
But why then, why would African governments commit themselves to collaborating with a court that doesn't do even the very basic things that they in their own countries insist on? It baffles me.
Well, in the first place, I can understand why many African countries, and indeed African countries make up the main bloc of signatories to the Rome Treaty, which created the ICC. And one only has to look at the history of crimes committed on this continent over the last century and a half to recognize why they may have been an attraction to sign up to this system of international justice. But
why?
Let me finish.
What was the attraction?
The attraction was that because of that history, there was perceived to be a need to have some means of ensuring that those like Bokassa, Mobutu, Vorster, Verwoerd could be brought to justice. And there was a genuine.
You don't think Charles Taylor falls in that category?
No, I don't actually. Not on that particular case. But I do think that was the primary motivation. But I think the mistake that many African countries made was not to read the fine print, not to look at, for example, the anomalous position of the most powerful countries on the Security Council, the United States, Russia, and China, who, although they can ask for a Gaddafi to be indicted or an al-Bashir, they're above the law. What kind of justice is that? And why did African countries sign up to that when they knew they didn't have a permanent member on the Security Council? They didn't have a right of veto. So why did they sign up to it?
Answer that question for me if you can.
Well,
why?
I think
Why do you think
because,
they did that?
as I say, I don't think they read the small print. I don't think also that they looked at the global power forces which would impact upon the workings of the ICC. I don't think they took that into account.
Well, African countries are going to have a meeting to discuss this very same issue. What do you think is going to come out of that process? Because with Kenya leading, a lot of African countries are now asking, in fact, the very same questions you yourself are asking. Do you think that they're going to pull out? The African Union as a bloc is going to say, let's pull out of this? Or do you think they are going to insist on very specific reforms?
Let's be quite frank about this. There's an element of opportunism in the way in which Kenya has now floated this issue of withdrawal, because we all know it's not by coincidence that this issue has come up just as William Ruto's trial began in the ICC. So we know that there is a backstory there which needs to be told. But at the same time, I do think that the ICC needs to be shaken up. And if it requires that the AU, or at least the majority of those 34 signatories, withdraw, personally, I think that's a good thing. Although there has to be some kind of forum put in place by the African Union to deal with issues of immunity. But the problem, as I perceive it, is that there could well be a split, because there's certain Francophone countries, for example, Cote d'Ivoire, who, from what I've been reading in the media, are unlikely to withdraw, given the fact that they've only recently sent Laurent Gbagbo there to be tried. So I think there could well be a division within those signatories. And I wait with interest to see how it works out.
So you think basically it's all about what? Vested interests?
Yes, it is. It's about Western vested interests in Africa, with the connivance in many circumstances of African heads of state for the exploitation of minerals here on the continent. That's what I think it's about. Let's just take Darfur. In all the debate about Darfur and the humanitarian crisis there, one of the things that's rarely mentioned is the fact that Darfur just happens to sit on a sea of oil, which many Western oil companies want to exploit. Is that just by chance? I don't think so. So when it comes to vested interest, I do agree. I think we need to wake up and realize that oftentimes this whole business of humanitarian intervention has as its base the interests of certain Western countries like France in Mali and neighboring Niger, because of their need for uranium. So I think we really do need, here on the continent, to sit up and smell the coffee and understand that when France sends its legionnaires into Mali, it's not because they're particularly concerned about the plight of black Africans. They're looking after their own interests backing France. That is the bottom line.
Okay. Now, if I heard you correctly, you're not arguing for a complete for doing away with the IEC per se, but for very significant reforms. Am I understanding you correctly?
My initial position is that African countries ought to withdraw en bloc, because that is not a system set up to provide justice to them, or indeed equality of treatment across the board between them and other powerful white countries around the world. So to that extent, I am not a supporter of the ICC. And my primary position would be that the African Union ought to withdraw and set up their own court here in Africa, well-funded, robust enough to bring to book even leaders of African countries. In fact, that's where they should start. So that's my primary position. My secondary position...
Before you get to your secondary position, what do you say to someone who says, but that's a pipe dream? It's
well,
not going to happen.
Well, I think I am not so pessimistic. And the reason I'm not so pessimistic is that continent-wide legal structures will necessarily develop in Africa, initially maybe for purely commercial reasons, as cross-border trade, as opposed to trade with the former mother countries, starts to take precedence. And I think on the back of that, as a necessity, there will be the development of a continent-wide system of human rights and respect for human rights. I think it will come, so I'm not so pessimistic.
Sometime in the
future.
It
depends on the will of the people on the continent. It depends on, you know, more powerful African countries like South Africa and Nigeria taking the lead and deciding this is something which for the future of our countries we ought to invest in.
Very briefly, let's get to your secondary position.
My secondary position is that, one, Africa, if the Security Council are to retain their referral role in the ICC, should demand a permanent member on the ICC. I really don't care which country that is, and I appreciate that there's competition at present between Nigeria and South Africa for that role. I'm not interested. But they ought to be campaigning for a permanent position on the ICC with a veto power as with the other 5 countries on the Security Council. I just find it outrageous that a decade into the 21st century, the most powerful body on the planet is still controlled by our old colonial masters. What are France and the United Kingdom doing there? And yet there isn't a single representative from either Africa or South America. How is that? How are these 2 insignificant European countries, how can they have that kind of power over the plight of millions?
Having a seat will change things fundamentally? Or are you banking on the Russia, China sort of alliance, if you like, with Africa?
Well, that's what diplomacy is about. But the point is, you can't have your voice heard in that forum unless you're there. And the point is, we're not there now. And of course, alliances will have to be built. In any diplomatic situation, that is the way in which the world works. So, of course, that present on the Security Council would have to be used strategically. But to my mind, that role could be quite crucial in changing the balance of power in that organization.
Mr. Griffith, thank you very much for your insight.
Not at all, my pleasure.